This story is titled, My Wife Wanted to Go on a Date Against My Wish. She wants free space for one night, so took revenge. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, please like this video and subscribe Positive Voices. Let's begin. Julian stood at the window of his new apartment overlooking the shimmering city skyline. It had been months since he had walked away from Camille, yet the echoes of their shared life still haunted him. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his thoughts drifting to the day everything fell apart. Camille's betrayal had cracked open something deep inside him, a raw, aching wound that no amount of time seemed to soothe. But tonight wasn't for mourning. It was for planning. Julian had only just begun to rebuild, but the fire of determination in his chest had never burned brighter. His revenge, though subtle so far, was far from complete. Camille had to understand not just the consequences of her actions, but the magnitude of what she had lost. Camille's life, in contrast, was unraveling at an alarming pace. What started as a single mistake, her thrill-seeking escapade, had snowballed into a series of misfortunes. Her co-workers whispered behind her back, friends avoided her calls, and she couldn't escape the suffocating loneliness that had taken root in her life. The man she had sought excitement with had turned out to be shallow and self-serving, leaving her with nothing but regret. One evening, as she scrolled through her phone, she came across a post from one of their mutual friends. It was a photo of Julian at a charity gala, his arm draped casually around the waist of a striking woman. Camille's stomach twisted as jealousy and despair churned within her. She had made a mistake, yes, but how could he move on so quickly? Did their years together mean so little to him? She slammed the phone down, her mind racing. If she couldn't have Julian back, she would find a way to at least disrupt his new life. Julian's days were filled with quiet victories. He had thrown himself into work, his newfound focus earning him a promotion and respect from his peers. Outside of work, he had taken up boxing, using each punch to channel his frustration and pain. It was there at the gym that he met Isabel again. Unlike their fleeting encounter at the bar, this time they shared more than a few polite words. Isabel was sharp, grounded, and unafraid to call Julian out on his guarded demeanor. "You're holding on as something," she remarked one evening as they cooled down after a sparring session. "Whatever it is, you'll never move forward until you let it go." Her words stayed with Julian. He didn't want to admit it, but Isabel was right. Part of him was still tethered to the pain Camille had caused. If he truly wanted to move on, he needed to sever that connection entirely. Meanwhile, Camille's attempts to meddle in Julian's life grew increasingly desperate. She showed up at events where she knew he would be, lingering on the outskirts and the hopes he would notice her. When that failed, she resorted to more invasive tactics, digging through his social media, reaching out to his friends under the guise of concern. But Julian's circle had grown protective of him, and her efforts were met with cold indifference. Her breaking point came when she received a formal letter from Julian's lawyer. It outlined the final steps of their separation, including the sale of their shared property. The cold, impersonal tone of the document sent her into a spiral. She had thought she could fix things, that Julian would eventually soften and let her back in, but this letter made it clear. He was done with her. Julian's revenge reached its crescendo one fateful evening. He invited Isabel to a charity event, knowing Camille would be in attendance. The room was filled with the city's elite, and Julian played his part perfectly, charming, composed, and undeniably magnetic. Camille watched from the sidelines, her heart sinking as she realized how far out of reach he had become. As the night wore on, Julian caught her gaze across the room. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then he turned away, his attention fully on Isabel. The message was clear. Camille no longer had a place in his world. Camille left the charity event feeling utterly hollow. The glitz of the venue and the hum of laughter seemed distant and mocking as she stumbled into the cold night. Julian's deliberate indifference had pierced her deeper than any words could. The image of him standing confidently beside Isabel was etched in her mind, a painful reminder of the life she'd thrown away. Back in her empty apartment, she stared at the remnants of what her life used to be. Photos from happier times, souvenirs from vacations, and the ring Julian had slipped on her finger years ago. It all seemed like a cruel joke now, mocking her with memories of a love she had taken for granted. She clutched her phone tightly, scrolling through their old messages, each one a testament to the man who had once adored her. Her tears flowed freely as she whispered to herself, "How could I let this happen?" Julian, on the other hand, felt a sense of vindication. The charity event had been the final act in a silent declaration of independence. Seeing Camille there, watching him with a mixture of longing and despair, had solidified his belief that he had made the right choice. But as the adrenaline from the night faded, a quiet unease began to creep in. Revenge, while satisfying in the moment, hadn't erased the pain she had caused. It lingered like a shadow, reminding him that healing was a journey, not a destination. Isabel, perceptive as ever, noticed a shift in his demeanor as they left the event. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice soft but probing. Julian hesitated before replying. "Seeing her tonight, it stirred up things I thought I'd buried." Isabel nodded, her expression understanding. "That's normal. Closure isn't a straight line, but don't let her control your narrative anymore." Her words struck a chord. Julian realized he had been living in reaction to Camille's betrayal, letting her dictate the terms of his emotions. It was time to take full ownership of his life, not just as an act of defiance, but as a genuine step toward peace. As weeks turned into months, Julian's life continued to flourish. He and Isabel grew closer, their bond deepening in ways that felt authentic and unforced. Unlike his relationship with Camille, which had been riddled with unspoken expectations and unaddressed wounds, his connection with Isabel was built on honesty. She challenged him, supported him, and most importantly respected him. Camille, meanwhile, spiraled further into despair. The whispers about Julian's success and his blossoming relationship with Isabel became impossible to ignore. She tried to distract herself with work, hobbies, and even dating, but nothing filled the void. Her guilt was a constant companion, gnawing at her with relentless ferocity. One evening, in a moment of desperation, she penned a letter to Julian. She poured her heart onto the page, admitting her faults, expressing her remorse, and begging for forgiveness. It was raw and vulnerable, a stark contrast to the confident woman she had once been. When Julian received the letter, he was surprised. The envelope was simple, with her familiar handwriting scrawled across it. For a long moment, he debated whether to open it. Part of him didn't want to revisit the pain she had caused, but another part of him was curious. What could she possibly say that hadn't already been said? As he read her words, a mix of emotions washed over him. There was anger at her audacity, pity for her despair, and a faint flicker of something resembling closure. But forgiveness, he realized, wasn't something he could give her. Not yet. She had to forgive herself first. He placed the letter in a drawer, unresolved about whether he would respond. Camille had been an integral part of his life, but she no longer defined his present or his future. That chapter was closed, even if the scars remained. Camille's final confrontation with Julian came months later by chance. They crossed paths at a park where Julian was walking with Isabel. Camille, looking visibly worn, froze when she saw them. Julian noticed her too, his expression unreadable. Isabel, sensing the tension, excused herself, leaving Julian and Camille to speak. "Julian," Camille began, her voice trembling, "I didn't expect to see you here." He nodded, his posture relaxed but distant. "It's been a while." She swallowed hard, searching for the right words. "I wrote to you. Did you get it?" "I did." He replied simply, and she pressed, her desperation barely contained. Julian sighed, his gaze steady. "Camille, I read your letter, and I appreciate the honesty, but it doesn't change what happened. You made your choice, and I made mine. There's nothing left to salvage." Her eyes welled up with tears. "I still love you." He shook his head gently. "Maybe you do, but love isn't enough when trust is broken. I've moved on, Camille. You should too." As he walked away, leaving her standing alone in the fading light, Julian felt a sense of finality. It wasn't bitter or triumphant. It was simply the end of a story that had run its course. Camille stood in the park for what felt like an eternity, staring at Julian's retreating figure until he disappeared from sight. His words echoed in her mind, carving deep wounds she couldn't escape from. Love isn't enough when trust is broken. It wasn't just rejection. It was a verdict on everything they had shared. The finality of it left her trembling, but in the quiet that followed, something shifted inside her. Camille realized that her fixation on Julian wasn't just about losing him. It was about losing herself. For years, she had taken his love for granted, using it as a shield against her own insecurities. Without it, she was forced to confront the person she had become, It was a painful reckoning, but one she could no longer avoid. Julian didn't look back as he walked away. Every step felt lighter, as though he were finally shedding the weight of a past that had clung to him for far too long. Isabel, waiting patiently on a nearby bench, gave him a soft smile as he approached. "Are you okay?" she asked, standing and slipping her hand into his. "I am," he said, surprising himself with how true it felt. For the first time, the sight of Camille hadn't stirred anger or longing, only a quiet acceptance that their chapter was over. They continued their walk, the cool breeze carrying with it a sense of renewal. Isabel didn't press for details, understanding instinctively that Julian would share when he was ready. Her steady presence was a stark contrast to the chaos he had once endured, and he found himself more grateful for her with each passing day. Over the following months, Julian's life flourished in ways he hadn't thought possible. His career reached new heights as he embraced opportunities with the confidence he hadn't possessed before. Isabel became more than just a partner. She was a confidant, a source of joy, and someone who reminded him daily that love could be nurturing, not destructive. Their relationship wasn't without challenges, of course. Julian's scars from the past didn't vanish overnight, and there were moments when his trust wavered. But Isabel's patience and honesty helped him navigate those struggles. Together, they built something strong and resilient, a testament to what was possible when both people were committed to growth. For Camille, the road was far more arduous. Julian's rejection had been a wake-up call, forcing her to confront the depths of her own self-destruction. Therapy became her lifeline, a space where she could untangle the threads of her past and begin to understand why she had sabotaged the one thing that had brought her true happiness. It wasn't easy. The sessions dredged up painful memories and forced her to confront truths she had long buried. She had to reckon with the fact that her actions had been driven by fear of vulnerability, fear of commitment, fear of not being enough. In pushing Julian away, she had been trying to protect herself, but all she had done was destroy the best thing in her life. Still, Camille persevered. Slowly but surely she began to rebuild. She found solace in art, rediscovering a passion she had abandoned years ago. Her social circle shrank, but became more meaningful, populated by people who valued honesty and growth. And though the ache of losing Julian never fully disappeared, it became a quiet hum instead of a piercing wound. Years later, their paths crossed again, this time at a mutual friend's wedding. Julian and Isabel arrived together, their connection evident in the way they moved as a unit. Camille, attending alone, felt a pang of longing, but also a sense of pride in how far she had come. When their eyes met across the room, Julian gave her a polite nod. Camille returned the gesture, a small smile playing on her lips. There was no need for words. They both understood that while their story had ended, it had shaped them in ways they couldn't regret. As the evening wore on, Julian found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The pain, the betrayal, the revenge. It had all been part of a process that had ultimately led him to a place of peace. He glanced at Isabel, her laughter lighting up the room, and felt a swell of gratitude. Camille, meanwhile, watched from afar, her heart heavy but hopeful. She had lost Julian, yes, but she had found herself. And for the first time in years, she felt ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold.